the Bronx. The streets buzzed with life, but it was the kind of life that came with edges. Rough, raw, and relentless. Narrow sidewalks filled with people who moved with purpose, kids playing ball in alleyways, and store owners exchanging nods and greetings. This was home to Emilio Ramirez, a 16-year-old who had learned early that dreams here rarely survived without a fight. Emilio and his mother lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on the fourth floor of a building that had seen better days. The paint peeled from the walls, the floors creaked, and the pipes groaned every time the heat kicked in. But Emilio never minded the place itself. To him, it was more than walls and windows. It was the backdrop of every memory, every note, every lullaby his father had once played on an old, weathered guitar. That guitar now belonged to Emilio. The strings were worn, the wood scratched, but when he strummed it, it felt like magic in his hands. His father had passed away when he was young, leaving behind only fragments of a dream, a worn guitar, and a notebook full of half-finished songs. Emilio often spent hours with that notebook, his fingers tracing the faded pencil marks his father had left, wondering what might have been if his father had had the chance. At 16, Emilio carried his father's dream like a torch. He practiced every chance he got, in the quiet early mornings and long nights after his mother had gone to bed. She worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, always tired, always worried, but she never stopped believing in him. "Your father would be proud of you," she would say softly, whenever she saw him strumming along to a tune he'd just created. Emilio held on to those words tightly, especially on days when the Bronx seemed too loud, too hard, too unforgiving. To him, the guitar wasn't just an instrument, it was a bridge, a way to connect to a man he barely remembered but deeply respected. And it was a way to hope, a flicker of light against the dark reality he saw all around him. The Bronx wasn't kind to dreamers, but Emilio was willing to try. With his father's music running through his veins and his mother's encouragement, he was determined to carve a different path, one strum at a time. It was a chilly Saturday afternoon, and Emilio stood on a corner near a small grocery store. The concrete beneath his feet was cracked, the walls behind him covered in graffiti that told stories of generations before him. His fingers hovered over the strings of his father's old guitar, nerves twisting in his stomach. He'd practiced countless times in the quiet of his apartment, but out here, with strangers passing by, he suddenly felt exposed. Taking a steadying breath, Emilio let his fingers find their rhythm on the strings. He played the opening chords, the familiar melody grounding him. The song was simple, a tune he'd come up with based on the unfinished notes his father had left behind. As he began to sing, his voice came out strong, filled with a surprising confidence he didn't know he had. At first, people passed by without stopping, barely glancing in his direction. But slowly, as the melody drifted through the air, 1 or 2 pedestrians paused, their curiosity piqued. A mother with a stroller lingered, nodding along with the beat. A man carrying groceries stopped to listen, a look of surprise crossing his face as he took in the young musician's raw talent. Emilio closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the music. In that moment, it didn't matter where he was or who was watching. All that mattered was the sound, the melody, the connection he felt to his father. He imagined his dad standing there with him, encouraging him with a proud smile. When the song ended, Emilio looked up to find a few people clapping, smiles of encouragement on their faces. One woman reached into her purse, dropping a few crumpled bills into his guitar case. "You've got a gift, kid?" she said warmly before walking away. A warmth spread through Emilio's chest, a mixture of gratitude and pride. This small corner of the Bronx had heard his voice, had witnessed a piece of his father's dream reborn. It wasn't much, just a few claps, a couple of smiles, but to Emilio it was a spark. For the first time, he felt a glimpse of something bigger, a hope that maybe, just maybe, his music could matter to someone else too. As Emilio packed up his guitar, a voice spoke from behind him. "Not bad, kid. Not bad at all." Emilio turned around and saw an older man leaning against the wall, watching him with a calm but intense gaze. He looked to be in his 60s, with silver hair peeking out from beneath a worn cap and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The man's clothes were simple but neat, and there was an air of quiet confidence about him. "Thanks," Emilio replied, a bit surprised that someone had taken such an interest. The man stepped forward, nodding toward the guitar. "That's a classic you've got there," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "Takes real heart to play one of those out here, especially in front of strangers." Emilio shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. I wanted to try. My dad used to play, and, well, I guess I thought maybe I could too." The man's gaze softened slightly as if he understood more than Emilio had said. "You've got something, kid. A voice people want to hear. But talent alone isn't enough in a place like this." He paused, studying Emilio's reaction. "You ever thought about taking it further?" "Further?" Emilio asked, his curiosity piqued. The man nodded. "Yeah, something bigger. A stage where people can really see what you're made of. Ever heard of a show called American Dreamer?" Emilio's eyes widened. "You think I could? Do you really think I could try for something like that?" The man gave him a small, knowing smile. "Kid, if you want this dream, you have to go out there and grab it. Name's Mike, by the way. I'll be around if you need a little guidance." Emilio watched as Mike disappeared down the street, his words lingering like the last notes of a song. The next day, Emilio spotted Mike sitting at a table outside a small cafe, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the world go by. Emilio hesitated, but Mike looked up and waved him over with a casual nod. Emilio approached, his guitar slung over his shoulder. "You meant what you said yesterday? About the stage thing?" Mike leaned back, studying him. "American Dreamer," he clarified, his tone casual but purposeful. "It's not just any stage, kid. It's a shot at the big leagues. Tough competition, high stakes." Emilio shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. I've only ever played on the street or in my apartment. I don't think I'm, ready for something like that." "Most people aren't ready for something like that," Mike replied with a shrug, "but that doesn't stop the ones who want it bad enough. Tell me something. Why do you play?" Emilio paused, surprised by the question. He looked down, his fingers tracing the strap of his guitar. "My dad used to play," he said quietly. It was his dream, but he never got the chance. Now I guess I want to finish what he started. Make him proud somehow." Mike's expression softened as he listened, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "That's a good reason, Emilio. A real good reason. But here's the thing about dreams. They don't just come to you. You have to go out and work for them. Sacrifice for them." Emilio nodded slowly, still hesitant, but feeling a spark of something new, a sense of possibility he hadn't dared imagine before. Mike leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Look, I've been around this industry long enough to know talent when I see it. You've got that spark, kid, but talent's only part of the story. Determination, grit, that's what separates the dreamers from the ones who actually make it." Emilio took a deep breath, considering Mike's words. "So, what do I do?" A faint smile crossed Mike's face. "First, you show up. Sign up for American Dreamer. Show them what you're made of. And no matter what happens, you keep pushing. You get knocked down, you stand back up, you fight for it." Emilio felt his pulse quicken. For the first time, he allowed himself to picture it. A real stage, a real audience, a real chance. And somehow, Mike's confidence made it seem possible. "All right," Emilio said, determination flashing in his eyes. "I'll do it." Mike nodded approvingly. "Good, then let's get you ready." That night, Emilio sat alone in his room, his father's old guitar resting across his lap. The hum of the Bronx filled the air outside his window. Honking cars, distant music, the sounds of people calling out to each other in the night. But for Emilio, everything felt quiet, like he was caught in the stillness before a storm. He thought about Mike's words. "You get knocked down, you stand back up, you fight for it." Those words echoed in his mind, pulling him forward, yet a part of him hesitated. He'd never done anything like this. Signing up for a televised competition felt miles away from playing on a street corner. The door creaked open and his mother peeked in. "Still awake, Mijo? It's late." Emilio looked up, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I was just thinking." She stepped into the room, her eyes gentle and patient, and sat beside him. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, then told her about the conversation with Mike, about American Dreamer, about the chance to do something that could change everything. As he spoke, his mother listened quietly, her face thoughtful. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Emilio, you've got something special," she said softly. I see it every time you play. Your father would be so proud, and whatever you choose, just know, I'll be proud too." Her words hung in the air, filling him with a warmth that chased away his doubts. He looked down at his guitar, his father's legacy, and felt the weight of both fear and hope pressing on him. "I want to try, Mama," he whispered. "For Dad, for you, and maybe even for me." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then do it, Emilio. Don't let anything stop you. You've got the strength of all of us behind you." Taking a deep breath, Emilio opened his laptop, pulled up the American Dreamer website, and clicked on the registration page. His hands trembled slightly as he filled out the form, but he didn't let himself stop. When he reached the end, he hovered over the submit button, closed his eyes, and pressed it. A quiet thrill ran through him as he realized there was no turning back. The day of the audition arrived faster than Emilio expected. As he prepared to leave, his nerves crept in. He could feel his hands shaking as he double-checked his guitar, tuning each string with painstaking care. His mother appeared in the doorway, watching him quietly for a moment. "Nervous, Mijo?" she asked, her voice gentle. Emilio nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I've never done anything like this before. What if I mess up?" She walked over and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Emilio, listen to me." Her eyes were warm and full of encouragement. "You have something real, something beautiful that the world deserves to hear. Your father, he's right there with you, in every note you play." He glanced down at his guitar, his mind flashing to the nights he spent practicing, his father's presence almost tangible beside him. "But what if it's not enough?" he murmured. She took his hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "It will be, Emilio. You just have to believe in yourself as much as we believe in you. No matter what happens out there, you're already a winner to me. Remember that." Her words washed over him, soothing his anxiety and steadying his resolve. Emilio nodded, a small but determined smile finding its way onto his face. "Thanks, Mama," he whispered, feeling a new strength welling up inside him. She cupped his face in her hands, her gaze fierce with pride. "Now go show them what you're made of, Emilio. Make us proud." With a final hug, he slung his guitar over his shoulder, took a deep breath, and walked out the door, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Emilio stood in the long line outside the American Dreamer audition hall, surrounded by contestants chatting, laughing, and nervously tuning their instruments. His heart pounded, his stomach twisted in knots. He clutched his guitar case tightly, feeling as if each second stretched into eternity. As he inched closer to the entrance, doubts started to creep in. What if I'm not good enough? What if I choke? He imagined the judges' faces, impassive and serious, waiting to decide his fate. His palms grew sweaty, and he found himself taking quick, shallow breaths. In that moment, he closed his eyes and took a deep, slow breath, letting the noise around him fade. He pictured his father, sitting beside him with that familiar, reassuring smile. He remembered his mother's words, her unwavering belief in him. Then he heard another voice in his mind, Mike's words from that first conversation. "You get knocked down? You stand back up. You fight for it." Emilio opened his eyes, his breathing steady now. He looked down at the worn guitar case, a reminder of the journey he'd taken just to reach this point. He'd practiced tirelessly, carrying his father's dream and his own. He owed it to himself to try. When his number was finally called, Emilio took one last deep breath, adjusted the guitar on his shoulder, and stepped forward into the audition room. His hands were still trembling, but his heart was calm, steady. This was his chance, and he was ready to give it everything he had. Emilio stepped onto the stage, squinting against the bright lights that made it hard to see the faces of the judges seated before him. He took a deep breath, his heart hammering in his chest, every sound amplified in the vast silence of the room. This was it, the moment he'd spent countless hours dreaming about. But now that he was here, it felt surreal, like he was floating outside his own body. One of the judges, a stern-looking man with glasses, gave a nod. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Emilio's hands shook as he adjusted his guitar strap, his fingers brushing over the smooth, worn wood of his father's guitar. This was the same guitar his father had played on countless nights, the same one he had held tightly through the years. Emilio closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering his father's face, the way he used to smile when he played. He opened his eyes and began to strum, letting the familiar chords guide him. The song was one of his father's unfinished pieces, a haunting, simple melody that spoke of resilience and hope. Emilio had spent years piecing it together from his father's notes, adding verses of his own, creating something that felt like a bridge between them. As he started to sing, his voice came out soft, uncertain at first, but with each note, he felt his confidence building. The words filled the empty spaces of the room, and suddenly it was just him and the music. He poured his heart into every line, letting the melody carry the memories, the love, and the loss he'd felt since his father's passing. Through the darkest nights, there's a light that never fades. In the quiet, it waits, guiding me home. The lyrics, simple yet powerful, resonated in the room. Emilio's voice wavered slightly on the high notes, but the raw emotion made it even more captivating. He was no longer singing just for the judges. He was singing for his father, for his mother, and for every part of himself that had ever dared to hope. Halfway through the song, he felt his eyes welling up, but he didn't hold back. Tears blurred his vision, but his voice grew stronger, richer, fueled by the memories and emotions pouring out of him. He remembered his father's warm laugh, his mother's gentle encouragement, and Mike's words pushing him forward. All those moments were wrapped into this song, echoing through the empty room. When the last note faded, a deep silence filled the air. Emilio lowered his guitar, breathing hard, feeling as though he had laid his entire soul bare in those few minutes. He couldn't see the judges' faces clearly, but he sensed a shift, a certain stillness that spoke louder than applause. After a moment, the judge with the glasses cleared his throat, his face softened. "Thank you, Emilio," he said, his voice steady but kind. "That was remarkable." The judge sitting next to him, a woman with warm eyes, leaned forward, visibly moved. "Emilio," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "you have a gift. I don't know your story, but I felt it in every word you sang. Thank you for sharing that with us." Emilio's heart soared. He had been so afraid of failing, of not being enough, but standing here, he realized he had accomplished something much bigger than impressing the judges. He had shared a piece of himself, a piece of his father, and it had been received with open hearts. As he left the stage, guitar in hand, Emilio felt the weight of his father's legacy resting proudly on his shoulders. For the first time, he knew that no matter what happened next, he'd already won something priceless. In the hallway, he took a shaky breath, wiping away a stray tear, and allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Emilio paced nervously in the waiting area, his mind racing. He replayed the audition in his head, wondering if his emotions had come through or if he'd simply looked vulnerable, raw. Around him, other contestants fidgeted, some chatting excitedly, others staring anxiously at the floor. Finally, a staff member stepped into the room with a clipboard. "Emilio Ramirez?" she called out, scanning the crowd. Emilio's heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and took a shaky step forward. "That's me." The woman smiled, her expression warm. "Congratulations, you've been selected to move on to the next round." For a moment, Emilio could only blink, trying to process the words. He felt a rush of relief, joy, and disbelief all at once. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, his voice thick with emotion. As she walked away, Emilio allowed himself a quiet smile. He'd done it. He was moving forward, one step closer to making his father's dream a reality. Emilio hurried down the street, nearly tripping over his own feet in his excitement. He could barely contain the news. It felt like it was bursting out of him. When he reached the apartment, he swung open the door, finding his mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. "Mama!" he called, breathless, his face alight with joy. She looked up, startled, then took in his expression and broke into a smile. "Emilio, what happened?" "I made it," he exclaimed, barely able to hold back his grin. "They picked me for the next round. I'm moving on, Mama." Tears filled her eyes as she rushed over, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "Oh, Emilio, I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you, mijo," she whispered, her voice trembling with happiness. They held each other for a long moment, sharing in the joy and relief. Finally, Emilio pulled back. "I need to tell Mike too. He's the one who pushed me to go for it in the first place." A short while later, Emilio found Mike sitting on a bench in the park where they often met. The older man looked up as Emilio approached, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Well?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. Emilio grinned, nodding. "I made it, Mike. They're giving me a chance." Mike chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Of course you did, kid. I never doubted it for a second." He paused, his tone softening. "But this is just the beginning, Emilio. Remember, you're not there yet. You've got to keep fighting, no matter what." Emilio nodded, his face serious but determined. "I will, Mike. I'm ready for whatever comes next." In that moment, surrounded by the people who believed in him, Emilio felt stronger than ever. Emilio stood backstage, his heart pounding as he listened to the roar of applause for the contestant before him. He had made it through the initial rounds of American Dreamer, each one bringing him closer to something he'd only dared imagine. But with each round, the competition had grown fiercer, and tonight, for the first time, he felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him. When his name was called, Emilio took a deep breath and stepped into the spotlight, gripping his guitar tightly. He scanned the crowd, feeling the intensity of dozens of eyes fixed on him, and suddenly, every ounce of confidence he'd built seemed to vanish. His hands felt clumsy, his thoughts scrambled, and as he strummed the first chord, he heard a sour, flat note echo through the room. A murmur spread through the audience, and Emilio's heart sank. He tried to recover, forcing himself to focus, but the more he struggled, the worse it became. His voice shook, his fingers stumbled, and the smooth, beautiful melody he'd practiced so hard for fell apart, piece by piece, until he barely recognized the song himself. By the time he reached the end, the audience's polite applause felt like pity. He avoided looking at the judges, dreading the disappointment he was sure he'd find there. One of them, the same stern judge from his first audition, cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "Emilio," he began, choosing his words carefully, "you've shown promise in previous rounds, but tonight you seem distracted, unprepared." Emilio swallowed hard, nodding, his cheeks burning with shame. "Yes, sir." The judge sighed. "This is a competition, Emilio. Everyone here has talent, but if you want to succeed, you need more than that. You need consistency, focus. Tonight, you didn't deliver." Emilio felt the sting of each word, each critique slicing through the thin layer of hope he'd been clinging to. He mumbled a quiet "thank you" before turning and walking off stage, his shoulders heavy with defeat. Backstage, he set his guitar down, staring blankly at the wall as the reality of his performance sank in. All those hours of practice, all the dreams he dared to believe in, it felt like they were slipping through his fingers. He'd let everyone down, his mother, Mike, his father, himself. The familiar weight of self-doubt settled over him, heavier than ever. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," he thought bitterly. "Maybe everyone was wrong about me." As he walked out of the building, a cold wind hit his face, matching the chill that had settled in his chest. He found a quiet spot outside and sat down on the edge of the curb, wrapping his arms around his knees. For a long time, he stayed there, alone, replaying every missed note, every stumble. The world around him blurred, his thoughts circling in an endless loop of regret and shame. In that moment, it was as if the fire that had driven him forward, the hope that had kept him going, had finally burned out. When Emilio finally made his way home, it was late and the streets were nearly empty. He dragged his feet up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. His mind was still swirling with memories of the disastrous performance, of the judge's words ringing in his ears. As he reached his apartment door, he paused, taking a deep breath before opening it. Inside, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her face looked paler than usual, her expression tired and drawn. She glanced up when she saw him, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Emilio's chest tighten. "Mama?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She managed a small, weary smile but didn't quite meet his eyes. "I've been waiting for you, Mijo. How was the audition?" Emilio hesitated, the sting of his failure still fresh. "It didn't go well," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I messed up, badly." She reached over and took his hand, her touch warm and comforting. "It's all right, Emilio. Sometimes things don't go as planned. You just have to keep trying." Her words, as gentle as they were, did little to lift his spirits. He looked at her, noticing the lines of worry etched deeper into her face. "Mama, are you okay?" She hesitated, and for a moment, Emilio saw a flicker of something, a vulnerability she rarely showed. I didn't want to tell you, but the doctors found something a few months ago, a problem with my heart. Her voice was soft, almost steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Emilio felt the ground shift beneath him. Why? Why didn't you say anything? He whispered, his throat tightening. I didn't want to worry you, Emilio. I know how hard you've been working, how much this dream means to you. I didn't want you to feel burdened. He looked away, his mind reeling, anger and sorrow blending with the overwhelming weight of his own failure. Mama? She squeezed his hand gently. Listen to me, Emilio. No matter what happens, I want you to keep going. Don't let anything stop you. Not my health, not this setback. You have something beautiful to share with the world. Promise me you won't give up. Emilio nodded, the words catching in his throat as tears pricked his eyes. In that moment, he felt smaller than he ever had, caught between his own broken dreams and the fragility of the woman who had always been his rock. For days, Emilio barely left his room. He kept the blinds closed, letting only thin slices of gray light filter through. His guitar sat untouched in the corner, its familiar shape almost mocking him with memories of hope and possibility that now felt distant, out of reach. Each time he looked at it, he was reminded of the failed performance, the sour notes, the cold disappointment in the judge's voice, the pity in the audience's applause. And now his mother's illness hung over him like a storm cloud, adding a weight he didn't know how to carry. How could he think about chasing a dream when she was facing something so real, so frightening? He replayed the judge's words in his head over and over. You need consistency, focus. Tonight, you didn't deliver. The words felt like a judgment not just on his performance, but on him, on everything he tried so hard to build. A voice inside him whispered cruelly, maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you never were. Emilio found himself withdrawing further, shutting out the few people who reached out. His mother knocked softly on his door each night, her gentle voice asking if he wanted to come eat with her. But he always mumbled an excuse, waiting until he heard her footsteps retreating down the hall before curling back into bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. He felt lost, as if the dream that had once given him purpose had turned on him, exposing every flaw, every insecurity he tried so hard to ignore. What's the point? He thought bitterly. I tried and I failed. Maybe it's better to just let it go. Days blurred together in a haze of disappointment and self-doubt. The music that had once been his lifeline felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to someone else. The Bronx, once filled with sounds that inspired him, now seemed unbearably loud, like it was mocking his silence. In that dark, quiet room, Emilio began to wonder if the dream he'd carried for so long had been nothing more than an illusion. That night, Emilio drifted into an uneasy sleep, his mind heavy with the weight of his failures and fears. In the silence of his dreams, he found himself standing in a familiar place, the cramped living room of his apartment, where his father used to play guitar late into the night. The room was bathed in a soft, warm light, and everything felt hazy, like he was seeing it all through a veil. And then he saw him. His father, sitting in his old chair, holding the guitar that Emilio now called his own. His face was kind, calm, as he gently strummed the strings, coaxing out a melody that Emilio remembered from years ago, a melody he hadn't heard since he was a child. Emilio stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. Papi? His father looked up, his eyes meeting Emilio's with that same familiar warmth. He didn't speak, but he smiled, a look of quiet pride lighting up his face. He continued to play, and Emilio could feel the music surrounding him, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. It was the same song Emilio had tried to finish, the song he had taken to the audition, but here it sounded whole, complete, as if every chord were falling perfectly into place. Emilio listened, his heart aching with a mixture of grief and longing. In that moment, he remembered why he'd started this journey in the first place. Not to win a competition, not to prove himself to the world, but to honor the man who had given him this gift. He remembered his mother's words, the quiet resilience she carried every day despite her own struggles. He remembered Mike's encouragement, the way he'd believed in him even when Emilio doubted himself. As his father played, Emilio felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. The self-doubt, the disappointment, the shame, they all began to melt away, replaced by something deeper, something that went beyond fear or success. It was a sense of purpose, of connection. The music was his, but it was also a part of his father, a part of his family's story. It was bigger than any one performance or judge's opinion. His father looked up, his gaze steady, as if passing on an unspoken message. "Keep going, Mio. Don't give up." Emilio's eyes filled with tears as he reached out, wanting to touch his father's hand, to hold on to that moment of clarity. But just as his fingers brushed against his father's, the dream began to fade, and Emilio felt himself drifting, waking up. When he opened his eyes, he lay in his dark room, the echoes of the melody still lingering in his ears. He sat up, breathing heavily, his heart pounding not from fear, but from something else, something close to hope. He looked over at his guitar, resting quietly in the corner, and this time, he didn't feel shame or fear. He felt a determination he hadn't felt before. Slowly, Emilio got out of bed, crossed the room, and picked up the guitar. His fingers found their place on the strings, and he began to play, softly at first, then with more strength, letting the notes fill the room just as they had in his dream. His father's voice seemed to linger in the silence. "Keep going, Micho. You're not alone." Emilio closed his eyes, and as the music flowed from his fingertips, he felt the fire return, burning stronger than ever. The morning light filtered through Emilio's window, casting a soft glow on the room. For the first time in days, he felt a quiet sense of resolve as he sat on his bed, his guitar resting on his lap. The melody from his dream still played in his mind, the memory of his father's presence as vivid as if he were still there beside him. Emilio took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He knew that getting back up after his failure would be hard, but his father's message, "Keep going, Mijo," echoed in his heart, giving him strength. He had come too far to turn back now. He wanted to make his father proud, to honor his family, and to prove to himself that he was stronger than his doubts. As Emilio stepped into the living room, he found his mother sipping coffee, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. She looked at him, sensing the quiet determination in his gaze. "I'm going back," Emilio said firmly, his voice steady. "I can't give up now, Mama. I have to finish what I started." A smile broke across her face, her pride unmistakable. "I knew you'd find your way, Emilio. Your father would be so proud of you." He nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There would be challenges ahead, but he wasn't afraid anymore. With his guitar on his shoulder, his mother's blessing, and the memory of his father's dream pushing him forward, Emilio was ready to face the competition once more, this time with everything he had. The night of the final round arrived, and Emilio found himself backstage, his heart pounding in sync with the roar of the crowd beyond the curtain. He gripped his father's guitar tightly, grounding himself in its familiar weight. This was it, the moment he'd worked for, the moment he'd almost walked away from. But now, he felt ready, driven by a purpose that was bigger than his fears. A stage assistant gave him a nod, signaling that it was time. Emilio took a deep breath, his mind flashing to the faces of everyone who had brought him to this point. His mother's unwavering support, Mike's steady guidance, and the gentle encouragement of his father, whose presence he felt in every note he played. Tonight, he thought, I'm playing for all of them. As he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights hit him, blinding him momentarily. He could just make out the silhouettes of the judges seated in front, their faces serious, expectant. The crowd quieted, waiting, and Emilio took a moment to steady himself, feeling a profound calm wash over him. He adjusted the guitar, closed his eyes, and let his fingers find the first chord of the song he had worked on for so long, the same unfinished song his father had left him, now complete with Emilio's own verses woven in. The first notes filled the air, haunting and beautiful, drawing the audience into his story. His voice was soft at first, a low whisper that carried the weight of every struggle he had faced, every doubt he had overcome. As he sang, his voice grew stronger, each note infused with raw, unfiltered emotion. It was a song about resilience, about love and loss, about carrying on when everything felt impossible. In the silence, I hear you guiding me through. In the darkness, a spark of light, shining for me and you. The lyrics filled the vast space, creating an intimate connection with every listener in the room. Emilio felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't fight them. This was his truth, his story, and he wanted it to be heard just as it was, honest, vulnerable, and real. As he reached the final verse, Emilio thought of his father, the dream that had been passed down to him, and the promise he'd made to keep going. He sang the last line with all his heart, his voice cracking slightly with the depth of his emotion. From you, I've learned to never let go. In my heart, your song will always flow. The last note hung in the air, the silence stretching as he let it fade. For a long, breathless moment, the room was still. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, growing until it filled the entire hall, rising into a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. Emilio opened his eyes, blinking through the tears, and saw the crowd on their feet. The judges were clapping, their faces showing a mixture of admiration and awe. The same judge who had once told him he needed consistency and focus now looked at him with something Emilio had never seen before: respect. One of the judges, a woman with kind eyes, leaned into the microphone. "Emilio," she began, her voice filled with emotion, "that was breathtaking. You didn't just sing a song tonight, you told a story, and I think everyone here felt it." The applause roared louder, and Emilio felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him, the likes of which he had never felt before. He looked out into the crowd, searching for a familiar face, and there she was, his mother, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands clasped together in pride. Somewhere in the depths of his heart, he felt his father's presence too, as if he were there, smiling, his spirit woven into the music. In that moment, Emilio knew he had fulfilled his promise. No matter what happened next, he had given everything he had, and he had done it for all the right reasons. He had played his heart out, and he had honored the legacy he held so dear. As the applause washed over him, Emilio bowed his head, silently thanking everyone who had believed in him, and finally himself, for having the courage to keep going. Emilio tried to calm his racing heart as he awaited the results, each second stretching into eternity. The host returned to the stage, microphone in hand, building the anticipation with every word. And the winner of American Dreamer is... The crowd held its breath, the air thick with suspense. Emilio Ramirez. Emilio's breath caught as the roar of the audience filled his ears. His eyes widened in disbelief before pure joy and relief washed over him. He felt himself pulled onto the stage, the bright lights blinding, the cheers a thunderous wave around him. The judges stood, clapping, their faces beaming with pride. Emilio spotted his mother in the audience, her face wet with tears, her expression one of boundless joy. She raised a hand, placing it over her heart, mouthing the words, "I'm proud of you." As Emilio held his trophy, he felt a rush of gratitude for every struggle, every setback that had led him here. He had done it, not just for himself, but for his family, for his father's memory. And as he stood there, a new dream unfolded before him, shining with endless possibilities. Thanksgiving arrived with a crisp autumn chill, and Emilio found himself back in the Bronx, standing on a small stage set up in the neighborhood park. The familiar faces of family, friends, and neighbors filled the crowd, their excitement and pride radiating as they gathered to see him perform. A banner stretched across the back of the stage, reading, "Welcome home, Emilio." Emilio scanned the faces, spotting his mother in the front row, her eyes brimming with pride. Mike was next to her, arms crossed, a small, approving smile on his face. Emilio's heart swelled with gratitude as he adjusted his guitar, the very same one that had started it all. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the crowd. "This community raised me, shaped me, and gave me the strength to keep going," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Tonight, this is for all of you. Thank you for believing in me." With that, he strummed the first chord, the melody filling the chilly night air, and the crowd fell silent, captivated. Each note was a testament to his journey, a gift of gratitude to everyone who had been part of it. As the song neared its end, Emilio paused, glancing at his mother in the front row. Her eyes shone with tears, her hands clasped over her heart as she listened, every bit as proud and supportive as she had been from the very beginning. Emilio smiled, his voice soft but steady as he spoke into the microphone. "This last song is for someone who's been my greatest inspiration, for the one who sacrificed, believed, and gave me the courage to keep going, my mom. He began to play a gentle, heartfelt tune, the melody filled with warmth and love. The lyrics spoke of resilience, of a mother's unwavering strength, and the bond they shared. His mother covered her mouth, overcome with emotion, as Emilio's voice wrapped around her like a warm embrace. As the last note faded, she rose to her feet, tears streaming down her face, and the crowd followed, cheering. As the applause settled, Emilio took a deep breath, looking out at the crowd filled with friends, family, and familiar faces from the Bronx. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and pride. Leaning into the microphone, he spoke with a quiet, heartfelt sincerity. "I've learned that dreams are rarely easy," he began, his voice steady, "and that we don't achieve them alone. Each of you here tonight has been part of my journey, and I wouldn't be here without you." He paused, his gaze finding his mother, then Mike, both watching with shining eyes. "Hold on to the people who believe in you, even when you struggle to believe in yourself. And no matter how hard the road gets, keep going." The crowd erupted in applause, Emilio's words resonating deeply. As he left the stage, he knew he had given them all he had: his music, his gratitude, and his story.